All right, good morning, Encounter Church. It's good to have you here this morning. I'm Pastor Terry, one of the pastors on staff here at Encounter. And if you are a guest this morning, welcome. It is so good to have you here this morning. Trust that this morning will be a blessing to you. You've blessed us by being here this morning. We're continuing a teaching series this morning, Growing in Jesus. It's one of our core values as a church. And in that growing aspect, we're talking about some Old Testament characters of the Bible. We started with talking about Noah and the flood and the ark and the animals, and what did that say to us about how we live our lives, and what does that tell us about God? Last week we started talking about Esther, and we're going to have part 2 of that this morning. And it's been an interesting time. For those of you who have missed any of these messages, just go to our website, and you can get the podcast there and be able to catch up. But just before I get into that, I always find it interesting on the Sundays that we have our offering before the message. And we're not quite sure as a staff whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Sometimes the offerings go up before people hear me speak. Sometimes, and we don't give you that opportunity very often. So we're going to check that out and see if our offerings actually go up before you hear me speak. But because you have heard the worship team, and they are incredible, and the worship that they led us in this morning. Yeah, we can give them a hand. And know that they do that because they love Jesus, and they have an opportunity here at Encounter to use their gifts. But it's good to be able to affirm people who use their gifts in whatever way. They tend to be very visible, but it's awesome. So we started last week talking about Esther, and we discovered that her story, like many of the characters in the Bible, whether you're the Old Testament, New Testament, Genesis, or all in between, our stories are complicated as human beings. Our stories tend to be messy as human beings, and especially this story of Esther. We were left actually probably with more questions going through our mind last week than answers. You know, we were a little bit amazed that God's not mentioned at all in the book of Esther. Author gives us no clue really as to what was going through Esther's mind when she made her decisions, or her cousin Mordecai. We just weren't told any of that. When we read that Esther was actively involved, she actively participated in that beauty queen contest, and she won. We were a little intrigued that nobody's praying in the book of Esther. Nobody's sounding religious. No one's asking God for guidance. There's no miracles in the book of Esther whatsoever. In fact, John Calvin, one of our great theologians of the past, was so bold as to say, I have no clue why the book of Esther is in the Bible. It was a mistake. Well, probably wasn't a mistake. It is in God's Word. So therefore, there is something in it that wants to teach us something about ourselves, our walk with God, and of course, it's going to tell us an awful lot about God, even though He's not mentioned. It tells us a lot about who He is. And so we're going to dive into part 2 of that this morning. So if you have your Bibles, turn them on, take them out. If you're using the Bibles in front of you or on those chairs, it's page 408. We're going to be starting at chapter 3. We were supposed to get a little further last week, but we didn't, so I'm going to kind of rush through a little bit of that this morning. But starting in chapter 3, just kind of hold it open, and we'll be going through some of those verses this morning. But again, the context, the story is taking place during the reign of King Xerxes I. It's in the area of Susa, the capital, which is today modern Iran. The king, we're told, was looking for a new queen. He had deposed the existing queen because she didn't do what he had asked her to do. So he said, you're no more, I need a new queen. His process of deciding how to have a new queen was to bring a bunch of virgins to his bed, and the one that would please him the most would be made queen. And so the interesting part of the story is that we're told that Esther, a Jew, was one of those virgins. She pleased the king the most, and she was made queen. So it did bring a lot of questions to mind, because Esther's not quite the heroine of the Old Testament characters that we are used to. Brought questions. At first it seemed like maybe she was making wrong decisions, or at least really difficult decisions on what to do. And yet, was God part of her story? I mean, is it possible that God, throughout all of those events, was there behind the scenes, because we see no mention of him, but was he there, and could he actually use even right decisions and wrong decisions to, at the end of the day, fulfill his purposes in her life, Mordecai's life, the life of the Jewish people, and by extension to you and me. So we were introduced not only to Esther, but to her cousin Mordecai. I mean, again, we don't know what was going through his mind, but he encouraged Esther to be part of the king's search for a queen. The only advice she got from him was just don't tell him you're Jewish. You know, again, not exactly what we expect from an Old Testament hero. Author Terry Muck, general editor of NIV Commentary, kind of says this about the whole story of Esther. He says it's perfect guidance if you're going through these things. Then he elaborated. When we find ourselves in a situation where right and wrong are not so clearly defined, and where every choice we have seems to be a troubling mixture of both good and bad. So we were intrigued, especially by the beginning of the story. Where was the story going to go from here with that kind of a beginning? And that's what we're going to look at today. The last verses of chapter 2 talk about kind of the context of where we're going to be going today. It sets the stage for the rest of the story. We find out that Mordecai, who has got this position in the outer courts of the king's palace, he happens to overhear two of the attendants of King Xerxes plotting to assassinate the king. And so he quickly has this message sent to Queen Esther, saying that there's these two guys who are, attendants to the king, and they're plotting to assassinate him. Queen Esther talks to the king and says, I think this is happening. He checks it out, finds out that that's true, has those two, of course, executed, and then abruptly forgets that it was Mordecai who saved his life. But don't worry, he comes back into the picture again. So, chapter 3 then. So that's kind of the context. Mordecai did this great thing for the king, but he's forgotten for now. So then look at verse 1 of chapter 3 of the book of Esther. It says this, sometime later, so after this foiled plot, sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the other nobles. So we're introduced now to the next character in the story, and that's Haman, who had some kind of a position, but now, for whatever reason, we're not told, it wasn't Mordecai. You would have thought that the guy who saved his life might have been promoted. Nothing about Mordecai, but this Haman guy now gets promoted. He's now become second in command. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman, in verse 2, to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. So this guy is all of a sudden promoted. He's second in command, next to the king. And then we read this interesting sentence at the end of verse 2. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. We'll just pause there for a moment. Again, we're not told what was going through Mordecai's mind. Like, was it because he loved God? Was it because he was a follower of Jehovah God and therefore he knew not to bow down to anybody else? It wasn't like he was worshiping him. The edict was just so when Haman came by, you just kind of bowed down and out of respect for him and his position. We're not told why, but Mordecai just refused to do it. Maybe he was just a stubborn old coot. We don't know what it was. He just didn't do it. So Haman, we find out, is furious. Now here's what happens when power goes to your head. Absolute power corrupting absolutely. Absolute power leading to violence. Absolute power so often leading to corruption. So in Haman's mind now, it's not just that Mordecai didn't bow down to him. He all of a sudden extended and said, well, Mordecai, and I guess he found out that Mordecai was Jewish. He said, you know what? I'm going to annihilate all Jews. I mean, it almost sounds like the king. Just at his whim, people die because they have absolute power. So we're told that lots were cast. They called that the Purim, and they had lots, and they did that a lot. You see that in the Old Testament, New Testament, these little like dice, and on these dice they had dates on it. And he was very superstitious, we're told Haman was, and so he cast these dice to find out what day and month of the year would be best to kill all the Jews. And those casting of the dice was called Purim. That was the word for dice or for casting lots. And of course, at the end of the story, you're going to find out that that's the day then that the Jewish people, even to this day, the Feast of Purim, where they remember that in fact that didn't happen. But that's jumping ahead, and so we're going to come back. I want you to see here, in this part of the story and throughout the story, God is working concurrently. He is working at exactly the same time. All these forces of evil are working, but at the same time, God is working. Now, we don't read about that, but we're gonna see how God is at work, and that's also true. And sort of keep this in the back of your mind. It's also true for your life. That where things could be happening, and we just sung about that this morning so beautifully. Things can be happening and they don't make sense. But we do need to understand that the God that we believe in his providential care, is there. And he understands what's going on. It's not catching him by surprise. We call that, the providence of God. So we're going to continue in the story. In chapter 4, I'm just going to kind of give you a summary of that. Mordecai hears about this plot that Haman has done now to have all the Jews annihilated. And we're told he goes into intense mourning. Like he takes off his regular clothes, he puts on burlap, he puts ashes on, which is what people in that day did to show that they were in deep mourning. There was deep sorrow going on. And again, we don't hear any reason from Mordecai about his thinking. Like, was he sad that he didn't just give us a little bow to Haman? Doesn't have to worship him, but because he didn't do that, all the Jews are being targeted for annihilation. Again, we're not told what was kind of going through his mind. But what we do know is that Queen Esther, as she's looking down from her palace window, she can see Mordecai dressed in burlap and ashes and wailing away. And so she has one of her attendants go and asks him, find out, why is he so intensely sad? So obviously she didn't know that there was this plot afoot against the Jews. Finally, through the attendants, he tells her the story, that the Jews are going to be annihilated. And he says to her, would you please go to the king and beg for mercy for the Jewish people? It's interesting as you read this story. Again, this is our heroine. This is Queen Esther. Her first response to hearing that all the Jews are going to be annihilated, her first response is fear. She's coming up with an excuse why she can't do that. And she says, now you know what the rule is, she says, in this palace, is that you don't go to the king unless he calls for you. If you go to the king and he hasn't called for you, he'll just have you killed. I mean, that was, again, absolute power. If he didn't call for you, you dare not show your face. Now, if you did and you stood there and he welcomed you in, he kind of put out his scepter and he said, you may enter, then you were saved. But generally, if you went in unannounced, that was the end of your life. So she was telling that to Mordecai. You know that. How can I do that? And he'll probably have me killed. That was her initial response, Queen Esther. And so now we come to this defining moment in Esther's life. So what is she, in fact, going to do? What's going to happen to the Jewish people? Well, look in your Bibles at chapter 4, verse 13 kind of sets this up. And it says, Mordecai sent this reply. And he's being a little harsh here. We're not quite sure what his motives are, but look what he says. Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace that you will escape when all of the other Jews are killed. And then look at verse 14, and I have this on the screen for you. Because this is what we kind of remember. If you went to Sunday school, this is part of what you remember now about Queen Esther. And he says this, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews is going to rise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. And I'll just pause there for a moment. Now, we're not quite sure what Mordecai's motives are right here. I mean, is he threatening her? Is he saying, if you don't do something, I'm going to tell on you, and I'm going to make sure that they know that you're Jewish? Again, we're not told what was going through their minds. But he was very clear in saying to Queen Esther, you may die going to the king unannounced, but you will die if you don't. And then he makes this comment. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this. So Esther has a decision to make. Her initial response was, no, I'm not going to do that because I might die. Again, no mention. She's not praying to God, at least that we can tell. We don't read anything about her trying to find some people to give her advice. We're given none of that information. We are wondering at this point, will she take responsibility for the life that God has given her? Will she take responsibility that there in fact is a plan and purpose for which she was created? I mean, at some levels, Mordecai's comment would imply to us that everything that has happened so far in Esther's life, from being Jewish to entering the beauty queen contest, to winning the contest, to becoming queen, could all of those things have actually been part of God's greater purpose in saving the people of Israel, in fulfilling his covenant to them, his promise to them, and by extension, his covenant and promises to you and to me? Is that possible? That it was for such a time as this that she was born. Is that possible? Could God have actually used all of that? And then we're told that Esther makes her decision. And it is a decision that will define her future, define the future of the Jewish people. It's what we remember her for. Our Sunday school stories tell us the question that Mordecai asked, were you here for such a time as this? And then her reply is verse 16. Esther sent this reply. Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I are going to do the same thing. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. And if I must die, I must die. It is a big decision. It's a defining moment because her decision changes everything. Her decision is going to give her the purpose for which she was created. Her decision is going to energize her. It's going to give her the confidence to do what she knows is right, regardless of the consequences. Author Karen Jobes writes this. She says, as a result of her decision to identify with God's people, Esther was personally transformed to the full dignity, to the full courage, and to the full power to be what she was, the queen of Persia. Another author puts it just a little different and takes it just a little bit further and suggests that through this traumatic event, Esther, initially a beautiful woman with kind of what appears to be a weak character, becomes transformed into a person with heroic moral stature and political skill. And maybe by extension this morning, we can ask ourselves the question, what might God be asking of me today? What's he asking of you today? And it may not have the consequences of saving an entire nation, but it might seem that important to you, right? Those decisions seem that important to me and to my life. We all have decisions that we're making on a regular, ongoing basis, and sometimes we put off that decision for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes not making the decisions has become so painful that we realize that we have to make a decision. We're just going to do it. We said last week that we all have to make decisions without knowing the end from the beginning. It's easy for us to kind of make comment on Esther's story after the fact. You and I are going through life where we have to make a decision today and we don't know the end result. What do? Especially when we realize that our history isn't always making the right decisions, because none of us have pure motives all the time. And for many of us, if we're a follower of Jesus, we do desire to live in obedience to Jesus. But even if that is our desire, life it's very seldom neat and tidy. If you're like me at all, we find ourselves in situations, right and wrong aren't always clearly defined. But as we discovered last week, that's okay. We live in a fallen world. Life is messy. And I would just say to you this morning that God does his best work in the middle of messes. Yours and mine. I shared this quote with you last week from Karen Jobes in her summary on this part of the life of Esther, and I have it on the screen today because I want you to see it. And she writes, regardless of whether Esther and Mordecai always knew what the right choice was, or even whether they had the best of motives, God was working even through their imperfect decisions and actions to fulfill his perfect purposes. And I want us to read this next one together because it's so powerful. So would you read this together with me? Even if we make the wrong decision, whether through innocent blunder or deliberate disobedience, our God is so gracious and omnipotent that he is able to use that weak link in a chain of events that will perfect his purposes in and through us. And then the final sentence, read this with me. In either case, Esther's story shows that we can entrust them to the Lord and move on. We can entrust that to God and then move on. I mentioned to you last week that one of the major themes in the book of Esther is the reversal of fortunes. We're thinking one thing, but the exact opposite happens. And this is the first one in Esther's own life. She's moving down this direction. Beautiful woman, kind of weak in character. She's the queen of Persia. She seems to enjoy that status. But then confronted with this life-changing decision, this defining moment, it totally reverses. And she actually becomes the queen of Persia with strength and moral character. But there's a couple more that are found in our story. It's the life of Haman. We're going to come to him next. And the great reversal of the destiny of the Jewish people. So there's two more of these reversals. Well, if we are to continue the story now that we find in Esther, chapters 5 through 8, it's a tragic comedy. But it shows us the result that God's purposes are again lived out through the lives of those who choose to follow him, whether we know all the answers, whether we know all the outcomes or not, whether we know the beginning from the ending, it doesn't matter. I guess it's the end from the beginning. Story picks up, Esther chapter 5. So Esther said, I'm going to go. It's against the law, but I'm going to go. If I die, I die. So she goes, and she stands there. She's waiting in the outer court. The king looks and sees her standing there. He hasn't called her. But she's obviously pleased him enough that he immediately grants her an audience. He holds out his scepter, and she comes to him. She's received. And he says, Queen Esther, whatever it is you want, it's yours. And she says, well, it's pretty simple. I would like to have a banquet and only 2 guests. I would like you to be there and your top official Haman, just the 2 of you. To which the king goes, well, great, that sounds awesome. I love parties. We found that out last week. He said, let's have a banquet. Let's do it. And then Haman finds out that he and the king are the only 2 invited to the queen's banquet. He is thrilled. Haman's feeling good about himself. The queen's invited him, not only to this one, but she said at the same time, and we're going to have another one the next day, 2 in a row. Haman's going, life is good. But of course, he's walking out, and there's Mordecai, and Mordecai doesn't bow down again. And Haman's furious, and he's mumbling and grumbling to himself, and he gets home. And his wife starts talking to him. He says, oh, my goodness, my life is terrible. This Mordecai person, he's just, no, I can hardly wait for that day when we kill all the Jews. And his wife says, well, you don't have to wait that long for Mordecai. I mean, you're second in command. Why don't you build this great 75-foot pole, put a nice sharp point on it, and let's impale Mordecai on it. How does that make you feel? And Haman goes, oh, now I feel better. Yeah, this guy's sick. Absolute power. Totally corrupts. And it did that to him. Okay, this has just happened. Here's another event on this side. The king is having trouble sleeping. So he orders his attendants to bring out this book that's being written about his life. So he's chronicling everything that's happening in his life, all the great things that King Xerxes is doing, and maybe reading his life is going to put him to sleep. I'm not sure what it is. But the attendant starts reading what's happening in the life of the king, and he comes to this point in the story where it says, and this Mordecai person foiled the plot to have the king assassinated. And the king, he says, did we do anything for that guy? You know, the guy who saved my life? And the attendant goes, no, we totally forgot about him. See, so Mordecai had no clue. He thought, okay, well, I saved the guy's life, but, nothing's going to happen. Oh, poor me. At that moment, like that morning then, Haman walks in. I just get this is an incredible story. Haman comes in, and the king asks him this question: what should I do for someone who pleases me so much? Now, he didn't say who it was for. He just says, what should I do for someone, who the king is pleased with? And of course, what's Haman thinking? Oh my goodness, I've just got promoted to second in command. Like, he wants to honor me. He's not telling me that, but he wants to honor me. So Haman's going through, okay, well, I think we got to give him royal robes, and he should be riding on a horse throughout the town, and there should be a royal emblem on his head, and someone should lead the horse through the whole town and saying, praise this person who pleases the king. To which the king says, excellent, Haman. That's an incredibly good idea. Let's do everything you said for Mordecai. I mean, can you just picture Haman's face? He's trying not to lose it in front of the king. No. And so it's exactly what he has to do. And it was the beginning of the end for Haman. Another reversal of fortune, another reversal of unexpected outcome has now totally switched to the point where that one who was going to die is now not only allowed to live, but is being empowered. Okay, but now we're at the second banquet. So this is the next day now. So Haman has to lead Mordecai on the king's horse all around. They attend the second banquet, the queen, the king, and Haman. The king asks the queen again, anything you want's yours. And then she finally shares the story. She says, please spare my life. She's now acknowledging that she's Jewish. She's telling the king, I'm Jewish. And the lives of all of my people, including myself, have been targeted for annihilation. At such and such a time, at the end of this year, we're going to all be killed. And she understands that, she has a little bit of power with the king, too. She kind of manipulates him just a little bit, like everybody else in the king's court is doing. She said, if it had only been that we were going to be sold into slavery, I wouldn't have even come to you, because that would have been way beneath, your decision-making. But, this is pretty serious that we're all going to be killed. Of course, the king's furious. Well, who would do something like this? And then Esther simply points to Haman and says, it's him. And the king loses it again. I mean, that's what he does. Who knows how much he had to drink already that day, but he was furious to the point where he had to leave the room. And now Haman, he's trembling, and he's just begging for mercy. He's begging for his life from Queen Esther. And then get this, so at that moment, he falls to his knees in front of Esther, just like prostrate before him or her, and say, please, please save me. Well, just at the moment that he falls down before her, the king comes in and thinks he's about to attack and assault the queen. Poor Haman. Goodbye, Haman, actually, is what we have to say. One of the attendants told the king, well, Haman was building this 75-foot pole, and he was going to impale Mordecai on it. And the king goes, nah, let's put Haman on there. And his life was no more. A reversal of fortune. But the story's not over, is it? Because you remember the decree that King Xerxes had put into effect? Well, it was a decree of the Medes and the Persians. If you've heard that phrase before, that means that if that decision was made, it could not be reversed, even by the king himself. He had signed it with his ring. He had put the signet ring into that. It could not be reversed. The queen's begging for mercy. He says, I can't change it. I made that rule. He says, but I am the king, so I can make another rule. And that rule said that across the empire, the Jewish people could defend themselves. Across the empire, the Jewish people could band together as one. They could attack anybody who attacked them, and if they won that attack, they could take those people's property, and it would start on the same day as the other decree. Well, the people of that nation started trembling in fear of what was going to happen. Many of them became Jewish so that they would be on the right side, and the Jewish people were saved. Another reversal of fortune. They were being targeted for death. Now, not only were they alive, but they were empowered to be the people that God had called them to be. And then Esther 9:22, our memory verse this morning, look what it says. This feast of Purim, this time on that date when they were supposed to have been killed, was when they were victorious over their enemies, and said this would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies. And then these key phrases, look at this, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. How often do we need that in our life through the difficult things that we're going through? God's word is pretty clear. That's not only true for the people of Israel, it's true for you and me. That no matter how difficult the situation is, there can come a time where our sorrow is turned into gladness, our mourning is turned into joy. There will be a reversal of fortune because of God and who he is and his promises to you and to me. Well, it leads us to the final reversal that I want to share with you this morning. And it has to do now with what we learn about God in the story. So we've seen about the providential care of God at work in Esther's life. All those seemingly unconnected events ending up to bring salvation to the people of Israel. God at work. But let's zero in on your life and mine. Because I want to say to you this morning that beneath the surface of even seemingly insignificant decisions and events that you and I make, God is at work in us and he's at work through us. Sometimes they're visible ways, but most of the time they're invisible. Most of the time God is at work in unknown ways. But those are ways that are governing our actions and our circumstances. He's doing this very often in his providential care without any outward miracles taking place. It's simply our faith believing that God is at work. I mean, would it be fair to say that for many of us this morning, we work through life's events, many that are unexpected. Oftentimes, they seem insignificant, and yet when we can look back, God has been there that whole time. For some of you this morning, it could be the events that have led up to your accepting Jesus into your life, and you can look back and you say, oh man, I had a grandmother, and she just prayed for me all the time. I never really listened. I didn't really follow what she said, but when I look back, she prayed for me like every day. And then God brought this person into my life, and then he brought this person into my life, and then I'm here at my baptism service. Because those events that seemed unconnected actually led me to this point. You're going to hear some of those stories this afternoon in our baptism at 3 o'clock of God working in the lives of men and women. Maybe it's a person that you were married to, and you can look back and it's like, wow, didn't see that one coming. Very seldom do you and I see the big miracles. But what we do see, or what we need to be more aware of, are simply the daily circumstances of life, the care and the protection of God. One moment that leads to another, that leads to another, and we may not see them all at that moment, but when we look back, God has been directing, and that should give us hope, and that should give us security, and that should give us purpose today. When we don't know the end from the beginning, but we have a decision to make, and we make it. Carol Ann and I have seen this throughout our ministry life. Probably some of the events that happened early on in our marriage and in our life have been key to allowing us to live a life of faith and trust. Because we know that God is faithful. We can remember we were living in Niagara Falls, Canada, and I was going to college, and we were married, and we had our first child, a daughter, and I was thinking about going to seminary and thinking that maybe God was calling me into that, but I wasn't quite sure. But it seemed like so we were testing. I checked in with some seminaries across the country, and one in Portland, Oregon, seemed to be the place where if I were to make that decision, that's where we would go. And I can remember it was in May or June of 75 or 76. And Caroline's going to this doctor's appointment, and she says, I just need to tell you that I think I might be pregnant. Huh? So we had a 4-month-old, and she's telling me that I think I might be pregnant, and I'm thinking, like, okay, now we're thinking about going to seminary. We're living in Niagara Falls. 3,000 miles away is Portland, Oregon. It's in another country. I don't think so. Like, if you're pregnant, we're not going. Those are my last words as she left the room and went to the hospital or went to the doctor's appointment, came back and said, yep, I'm pregnant, and we both said, yep, and we're going to go to seminary. But, did that make any sense? Not really. And then we had those kinds of stories as we went along, and so we're in Oregon, and I'm at seminary, and I'm taking classes, and it's getting close to the time when our son was going to be born in March of 77. And about 2-3 weeks before he was to be born, Caroline kind of gives me this nudge in bed, and she says, look at this. And I'm looking at her stomach, and it's just like going around and around and around, and it's just like, ooh, you almost got sick, but not quite, because it was fascinating. And she said, I think maybe he's turning around in there. We didn't know it was a he yet, because those were the olden days. You had to wait till they were born before you found out what they were. She said, we better go to the doctor. So we went to the doctor, and of course the doctor first was pushing over here. He said, I think we made a mistake. I thought the head was over here, but the head was over here. I think you got twins. No, like this is not good. But then we found out, no, he had just flipped. He just literally did a somersault inside, but it was so bad, the breach was so bad, they said, you have to have a cesarean. I said, okay, so these different events are happening, but that in and of themselves were not like, when we went to seminary, we were here on a student visa, so we couldn't work. So we had to just prove that you could work without having any money come in. Like, seriously, how do you do that? We had our parents write notes to the government saying, oh yeah, we'll support them. Our parents had nothing. But it was God leading us, so we knew that somehow something would happen, and it did. But it was really tight. It was like really, really tight financially. One of the churches in the area said, if you clean our building every weekend, we'll pay your house rent, which was like $75 a month at that point. Like I'm really old, so that was a long time ago. But they did that, and so but it was tight. It was hard. So then we realized, okay, well, we have the cesarean. So we did. Well, then we got introduced to the U.S. health system. We were covered with our Canadian health care, where if you had a cesarean, it would be about $300. So we're going back now to 77. We got this really cool itemized bill from the hospital. But in Canada, you never see a bill, like down to how many slippers the doctor was wearing. I mean, this was absurd. $3,000, 10 times what it cost in Canada. We couldn't pay that. Like, what are we going to do now? And so it's like, I told you, we should not have come. It's a mistake. And then someone said, well, if you have an unforeseen financial circumstance, you can apply for a work permit. Well, that's interesting. We applied for a work permit. And didn't hear anything. A couple of months, 3 months. Finally, I said, I'm going to go down to immigration. Now, that's a scary place. It's just not a really fun place. But we went. And there was a substitute guy on that morning, and he's looking and looking at my form, and it says, so you had a baby. I said, yeah. Well, in the States, having a baby is not an unforeseen circumstance. We know how that happens. Maybe in Canada you don't. I mean, he was starting to get snarky with me, and I was ready to get snarky back, but I realized you don't get snarky with immigration because they can just go and send me out of the country again. So I said, no, cesarean. And he goes, oh. I'm not sure he even knew what that was, but he goes, oh, okay. So he goes through this big stack. They're just one-page applications. In the middle was mine. He pulls it out. He looks at it, stamps it. And for 2 years, we had a work permit. So how does being pregnant in 76 lead to a work permit in like 78? Like and all the events that have to happen in between there. It does, because God is at work. We didn't necessarily see miracles happening, but this event led to this event, led to this event, and all of a sudden we got to work, and I had a really good job there. And I was able to support our family, and we were able to get through seminary because of the providence of God. It's true in your life and in mine. But not all circumstances, right, are positive ones. Not everything was positive for Esther. It's not always positive for us. We also go through circumstances that bring us heartache and tragedy, circumstances that are ugly and destructive. But I want to share with you that God's providential care is still a part of that. Like some of these really hard things in our life, we would never say are good in and of themselves, because they're not. I know for some of you this morning, the whole story of Esther, the brutality of King Xerxes towards women, his sexual abuse of women. It brings to mind for some of you this morning the abuse that you have gone through. And the hurts are still there and the scars still remain. Understand, God does not cause those hurts. God can't do evil. But you do need to understand that his providential care says that he is there with you. And he can take even those events if you let him. And he can take them and lead one thing to another to another. And God can take all of our events, the good and the bad, the tragic and the happy, and he can use them to form Jesus Christ in us because of who he is. But the only way that you and I can do that, the only way that we can live our lives truly today, I don't know how people do it without God. How we can get through the good and the bad, the joyful and the sad, the only way we do it is through Jesus, because that's the ultimate reversal of fortune. The ultimate reversal of fortune. You see, because of your sin, yours, my sin, we live in exile. We don't live in the Garden of Eden anymore. Have you realized that? Like, the world we live in is incredibly fallen. And because of that, we should expect nothing but death. Because we rebelled against God, our sentence is death. God owes us nothing. And yet, Christ's resurrection from the grave is the ultimate reversal of the expected outcome. Our penalty should have been death, eternal death. But it isn't. Jesus was supposed to die and remain dead, but he didn't. He rose again. And because he rose, he reversed your fortune and mine from death to life. He reversed the sentence, not because you and I were so good that he said, oh, they deserve it. No, because God chose us in Christ. And Jesus chose to pay our price. And nothing, friends, nothing can stop God's purposes. We've seen it from Genesis to Revelation in the world in which we live. Nothing can stop the purposes of God. Nothing. We're going to come to the communion table now and celebrate that great reversal of fortune. Because Jesus, when he was with his disciples, said, I'm going to die, and when I die, you're going to take this bread. And every time you take this bread and eat it, you're going to remind them my body was broken because I've reversed things. And you're going to take this cup, and it's going to represent my blood, and it's going to represent the reversal of where you should have been dead, but now you're alive. Every time you take it, you're going to remember, I paid the price, and your sentence was death, but now it's life. If you're new to Encounter Church, you just need to know that for us here, you don't have to be a member. You don't have to have attended more than once. Just here this morning, if you follow Jesus, if you've invited him into your heart and life, again, you're going to hear that this afternoon in the baptism. They're going to talk about that decision, and then their public testimony is baptism. If you've made that decision, you're going to be invited to participate. We pass the bread around first, just those little wafers. You can just take one. The cup will come. You just take one of the cups and just hold them. Our worship team, they're going to join me at the front. They're just going to be kind of playing in the background. And when God leads you and you felt that, you can just take the bread and you take the cup. Just do that personally. And just use this as a moment to thank God for the reversal that he has allowed for you and I to experience from death to life. Let's pray, and then we'll receive. Father God, we believe. We believe in Jesus. We believe that he paid the price for our sin. We believe that through his broken body and his shed blood, that new life has been given to us, not because we've earned it or deserve it, but because you have given that to us in exchange. You have reversed our fortune from death into life. And for this we praise you. In Jesus' name, amen. If you would please come.